Lakeside Hills was the kind of neighborhood that seemed to exist in a perfect bubble, a suburban dream where everything appeared to be in its place: immaculate lawns, tidy houses, and families that looked as if they'd stepped out of a magazine. The kind of place where no one expected anything out of the ordinary to ever happen. But in the quiet corners of Lakeside Hills, beneath the pristine surface, something was brewing, a storm that would soon shatter the illusion of peace. In one of the most well-kept houses on the block, Sophie Turner sat by the window, gazing out at the calm waters of the nearby lake. Her home, a grand two-story building with ivy creeping up the walls, had been her sanctuary for years. From the outside, her life seemed enviable, the epitome of success. She had the perfect family, the perfect home, and the perfect life. But Sophie knew better than anyone else that perfection was a facade. Sophie Turner, in her early 30s, was a striking woman. Her features were soft yet alluring, her blue eyes sparkling with a mix of longing and resignation. Her platinum blonde hair, which she wore loosely around her shoulders, framed a face that was often calm and composed, but today, there was a hint of melancholy. She had once felt secure in her role as a wife and mother, but now, the weight of isolation was becoming unbearable. The quiet house, the silence of the evenings, the emptiness that filled the space once shared with her husband, it all pressed down on her, suffocating her. David Turner, her husband, was a successful financial advisor, the kind of man who could walk into any room and command attention. His career had been everything: his ambition, his long hours, his drive to build a future that, in his eyes, would provide for his family forever. Sophie had once admired his dedication, his strength, but lately, she could hardly remember the man she married. The man who had once surprised her with flowers, planned impromptu weekend getaways, and made her feel loved. Now, David was a shadow of that person, consumed by work and unable, or unwilling, to see the loneliness that was slowly consuming his wife. The distance between them had been growing for months, maybe even years. Sophie had tried to fill the void with small distractions: gardening, volunteering at the local animal shelter, hosting neighborhood gatherings. But none of it worked. The ache inside her only deepened. She longed for connection, for a touch, for someone who would look at her and truly see her. She wanted someone to notice that the woman who used to laugh, who used to be full of life, was now slipping away. And then came the block party. It was an annual event in Lakeside Hills, a lively occasion where the neighbors came together to celebrate the arrival of spring. Sophie had attended every year without fail, a fixture of the event, smiling and chatting, keeping up appearances. But this year was different. Sophie had dressed carefully, as though she were preparing for something more than just another mundane gathering. She wanted, perhaps subconsciously, to feel alive again, to feel that spark she hadn't felt in so long. And it was at this gathering that she first saw Nathan West and James Price, two men who would change everything. Nathan West was a new face in the neighborhood, a mechanic with a rugged charm. His hands were calloused from years of hard labor, and there was a rawness to him that Sophie found impossible to ignore. Unlike David, who was always so polished and distant, Nathan wore his flaws on his sleeve. His relationship with his wife was rocky, everyone knew that, and yet, he wore his vulnerability like a badge of honor. Sophie couldn't help but feel drawn to him, his presence somehow grounding in a way she hadn't experienced in years. James Price, on the other hand, was everything Nathan was not. A well-dressed architect, polished and refined, James had a certain elegance about him. He was the kind of man who made people feel comfortable, valued, as though they mattered. Sophie found herself captivated by him as well, the way he listened, the way he seemed genuinely interested in her words. He wasn't as overt as Nathan, but there was a depth to him that Sophie couldn't ignore. In that brief moment, Sophie realized something that terrified her: she was desperate for the attention of both men. The days following the block party were a blur for Sophie, a mix of fleeting glances and unspoken promises, the heat of two men's attention lingering in the air around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the cracks in her carefully constructed life were beginning to widen. Sophie wasn't sure what it was exactly. Was it the thrill of being noticed, the rush of attention that had eluded her for so long, or the undeniable pull of desire? All she knew was that for the first time in ages, she felt alive again. She hadn't expected much to come of it. After all, Nathan was married, and James had his own family. But their presence, their focus on her, it felt intoxicating. Each time she saw either of them, a small fire ignited inside her, a spark of something wild and forbidden that she had long suppressed. And it wasn't just the superficial attraction, the kind one might dismiss. No, this felt deeper, more consuming. By mid-April, Sophie's encounters with Nathan and James were becoming more frequent. It started off small, chance meetings at the grocery store, brief exchanges at the local coffee shop. Casual, polite conversations about the weather or the neighborhood. Sophie would smile, laugh softly at their jokes, and pretend that nothing was happening, that her heart wasn't racing every time one of them appeared. But she could feel the tension building beneath the surface, a pull she couldn't explain, and neither could they. It was Nathan who made the first move. One afternoon, Sophie was at the local hardware store picking up a few things for her garden when she ran into him. The encounter was seemingly innocent, a simple exchange of pleasantries, but it was different this time. Nathan's eyes were warmer, his smile more knowing. He stood closer than necessary, his voice lower, as though they shared a secret that neither of them had voiced aloud. As they stood in the narrow aisle, Sophie reached for a jar of fertilizer, and their fingers brushed, just a touch, barely noticeable, but enough to send a jolt of electricity through her body. It was an accident, of course, but the moment hung between them like a spark waiting to ignite. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, and she felt an unfamiliar heat spread across her cheeks. She pulled her hand back quickly, but Nathan's gaze lingered on her, intense, searching. "Maybe I'll stop by and check on that garden of yours sometime," he said with a grin that made Sophie's stomach flip. "You know, help with the heavy lifting." She couldn't help but smile back. "I'd like that," she said before quickly adding, "but only if you have the time." He chuckled. "I always have time for you." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. She knew it was reckless. She knew she should pull away. But there was something magnetic about Nathan, something raw and untamed that spoke to a part of her she hadn't known existed. Later that week, Sophie found herself at Nathan's garage under the pretense of needing a minor repair on her car. She told herself it was just an excuse, just a reason to see him again, but deep down, she knew she wanted more. Her body, her mind, everything about her was drawn to him. As she pulled into the driveway of his modest home, her pulse quickened. She knocked on the door, and Nathan appeared, wiping his hands on a rag, his smile as easy and inviting as ever. "Needed something fixed?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, as though he could see right through her. Sophie hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Just a quick checkup. I didn't want to bother my husband with it." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "No bother at all," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The moment she crossed the threshold of his garage, Sophie felt a shift. It was as if the world outside had disappeared, and all that remained was the man standing before her, the man who made her feel seen, wanted, alive. The repair was trivial, a simple fix on a loose hose, but that wasn't what kept Sophie there. It was the way Nathan's touch lingered on the car, the way he looked at her when their eyes met. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with something unspoken. He was close now, so close she could feel his breath on her neck. The warmth of his presence was overwhelming. Before Sophie could stop herself, her lips parted in invitation. Nathan didn't hesitate. He leaned in, his kiss urgent and hungry, as though he, too, had been waiting for this moment. The world seemed to fall away as Sophie gave in to the moment, the weight of everything she had been suppressing suddenly lifting. It was a moment of pure indulgence, raw and unrestrained. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie felt something other than emptiness. She felt alive. But even as the passion flared between them, a small voice in the back of Sophie's mind warned her that this was only the beginning. That one kiss would not be enough. She was about to enter a world where nothing was simple, nothing was certain. The consequences would be far-reaching, and she could already feel the weight of them pressing down on her. Sophie left Nathan's garage that day with her heart pounding in her chest, her mind spinning. She couldn't tell if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if she had finally taken the first step toward finding something real. Either way, she knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. As days bled into weeks, the weight of Sophie's decisions began to settle into the marrow of her bones. The brief encounter with Nathan had been only the beginning, a spark that ignited a fire she wasn't sure she could control. Each stolen glance, every private conversation, made her feel more alive, but also more torn. What had once seemed like an innocent flirtation was now a dangerous game. She could no longer pretend that her connection with Nathan was merely the product of loneliness or curiosity. The truth was, Sophie was drawn to him in ways she didn't fully understand. Nathan's rawness, his unpredictability, was a sharp contrast to the carefully constructed life she'd built with David. He was everything that had been missing, a reminder of passion, freedom, and a kind of authenticity that Sophie had long forgotten. When Nathan looked at her, it wasn't with the indifference of someone too busy to care, like David. His gaze was intense, piercing, as though he was trying to read her every thought. She found herself wanting to be seen, wanting to be needed by someone who didn't merely tolerate her but actively desired her. Yet, as much as Sophie wanted to believe that Nathan was her escape, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach, the knowledge that she was slipping further away from her own moral compass. Guilt followed her everywhere. It clung to her like a second skin, especially when she looked at David. There were moments when she caught him staring at her, the brief flicker of concern in his eyes that he quickly masked with a forced smile. He had noticed. He had to have noticed. But Sophie told herself that she was only doing what anyone in her position would do. After all, David had been absent, physically and emotionally, for so long. She was entitled to feel wanted, to experience the passion she had been deprived of. And Nathan, despite his flaws, made her feel alive. He made her feel like she mattered, something that David no longer did. Yet, even as she justified her actions, Sophie's internal conflict began to rage. She wasn't just emotionally torn between two men, she was grappling with a much deeper issue. Her affair with Nathan wasn't just a way to fill the void left by David's neglect, it was a desperate cry for validation, for meaning. She had been invisible in her own marriage for so long, and Nathan had come along at exactly the right moment to give her what she had been seeking: attention, affection, and, most of all, recognition. But in the quiet corners of her mind, Sophie knew that Nathan was not the solution to her emptiness. He was only a temporary fix, a distraction from the deeper issues that lay within herself. And then there was James. The attention he lavished on her was different, subtler, yet no less intoxicating. Sophie had always been attracted to men who made her feel admired, valued. James, with his quiet charm, was the kind of man who listened, who seemed to genuinely care. He never rushed her, never pushed for anything. His presence was like a warm embrace, offering her solace, a reprieve from the chaos. When they spoke, Sophie felt as if she could say anything and everything, and yet, in his eyes, she felt a warmth that made her feel like she had been seen for the first time in years. At first, she thought she could handle both men. After all, they were so different, and her connection with each of them served a different need. Nathan filled her with desire, a longing for something wild and untamed. James, on the other hand, gave her emotional connection, an escape from the loneliness that plagued her home life. But as the weeks went on, the lines between these relationships blurred. Sophie found herself more drawn to both men, torn between the thrilling intensity of Nathan and the steady, reliable affection of James. Her inner turmoil reached its peak when she found herself thinking about them both, at the same time. Her thoughts became clouded, a swirling mess of guilt and desire, of love and lust. Every time she kissed Nathan, she could feel James's absence, like a shadow trailing her every move. And when she spoke to James, she felt Nathan's touch lingering on her skin, reminding her that her choices were no longer hers alone. She was slipping into a dangerous web of lies, one where the boundaries between love, need, and desire had become hopelessly tangled. What Sophie didn't know, or perhaps what she was unwilling to admit, was that the tension she was feeling was about to explode. Her carefully curated double life, her perfect facade as a devoted wife and mother, was beginning to crack under the pressure of her own emotions. The more she leaned into these dangerous liaisons, the further she pulled herself away from the woman she used to be. She had wanted to feel seen. She had wanted to escape the loneliness that had settled into her marriage. But as she walked deeper into the labyrinth of deception, she was losing herself in the process. And with each step, the stakes grew higher. It wasn't just about feeling wanted anymore, it was about needing to be someone else, to escape the suffocating reality of her life. Sophie could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting as she struggled to maintain her control. The momentary thrills she had with Nathan and James were fading, leaving behind a deeper, more insidious emptiness. The lies she had told to keep her secrets were no longer enough to shield her from the truth, that in trying to escape her own loneliness, she was spiraling into something much darker than she ever imagined. And what scared her most was the thought that she might never be able to find her way back. The tension in Sophie's life had been building for weeks, but it wasn't until one warm evening in late May that everything began to unravel. It happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that Sophie hardly had time to process the shift before she was caught in a storm of her own making. She had just come home from another stolen afternoon with Nathan, one of those fleeting moments where passion flared like a fire, only to leave her with the deep, gnawing emptiness she had grown accustomed to. She had told herself that it was worth it, that the brief escape from her life was something she deserved. But as she entered the house, her pulse quickened, and the familiar weight of guilt pressed down on her chest. She could feel David's presence before she even saw him. He was sitting in the living room, his back straight as he sat in his usual chair by the window. His gaze was fixed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't noticed Sophie enter at first. For a moment, Sophie hesitated. She wanted to turn around, to leave, to do anything but confront what she knew was coming. But there was nowhere to hide, not anymore. The walls in their home, once a sanctuary, felt like a prison now. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, seemed to weigh on her, reminding her of the life she had tried to preserve but was now crumbling at her feet. David looked up, his eyes sharp, piercing. There was something different in his gaze, something dark, something knowing. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. He had found out. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. "Where were you today, Sophie?" David's voice was calm, too calm. But it was enough to send a chill running down her spine. Sophie stood frozen for a moment, caught between the urge to lie and the knowledge that nothing would be able to save her now. The lies, the excuses, they all felt empty now. How could she hide it when it was so clear in his eyes? His silence, his stillness, had given way to something else, suspicion. I was out, just running errands," she said, her voice sounding hollow in her own ears. Her breath hitched, but she fought to keep her composure. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the house itself was holding its breath. David's eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips pressed into a thin line. He stood up slowly, never taking his gaze off her. "I don't believe that, Sophie," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of years of pent-up frustration. "You've been distant lately. I've noticed the way you're avoiding me. And I've noticed something else, too, your behavior has changed. You're not the woman I married anymore." Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears. Her heart raced. She had hoped, no, prayed, that she could keep up the act just a little longer, that somehow, everything would stay buried. But now, standing before David, the truth felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. "You've been seeing someone, haven't you?" David's words hung in the air between them, slicing through the tension. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Her world, the one she had worked so hard to maintain, was unraveling in an instant. There was no escaping it now. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sophie managed, though she could feel the lie slipping from her lips as easily as the sweat that formed on her brow. David shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Don't lie to me, Sophie. I know." His voice broke then, the anger and hurt spilling out. "I don't know when it started, or with who, but I know. I can feel it." His eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and rage. "I've been so blind, haven't I? I thought I could just keep pushing, keep working, and everything would be fine. But it's not. You've been out there, living a life I don't even know, with someone else. How long, Sophie? How long have you been lying to me?" Sophie felt as though the room was spinning. The guilt she had been carrying for weeks was finally crashing down on her, and she could no longer deny the damage she had done. She had wanted to feel wanted, to escape the suffocating loneliness of her marriage, but in doing so, she had pushed David to this breaking point. And now there was no turning back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt empty. They couldn't fix the devastation that had already taken root. Sophie had destroyed the one thing she had tried so hard to hold on to. In seeking attention from Nathan, in falling into a relationship with James, she had betrayed David, and she couldn't undo it. The love they once shared had been chipped away, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the hollow echo of what had once been. David took a step back, his face clouded with hurt. "I don't know what you want from me anymore, Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've broken me. And now, I don't know if I can ever trust you again." For the first time, Sophie saw David not as her husband, but as a man completely broken by her actions. His face, once full of love and admiration for her, now bore the marks of someone who had been utterly betrayed. Sophie had torn apart the very fabric of their marriage, and no amount of apologies could heal the wounds she had inflicted. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Sophie didn't know what to say. She had no words left. She could feel the weight of the moment settling in, and it was suffocating. She had pushed her family to the edge, and now, there was no turning back. The consequences of her actions were no longer just a matter of guilt, they had become her reality. As David turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sophie standing there in the aftermath of her choices, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The betrayal had fractured their lives in ways she couldn't fix. The question now wasn't whether she could salvage her marriage, but whether she could live with the consequences of the life she had chosen. Sophie sank into the chair, her body heavy with the weight of her mistakes. She had wanted to escape the loneliness, to feel alive again, but in doing so, she had destroyed everything that had once mattered. The silence that followed was deafening. The days after Sophie's confrontation with David were a blur of guilt, confusion, and an aching sense of inevitability. She had hoped, prayed, that somehow, things might return to normal, that perhaps David could forgive her, that their marriage might survive the chaos she had caused. But deep down, Sophie knew that the damage was irreparable. The chasm between them had grown too wide to cross. David didn't speak much after that night. He had become distant, colder. He would leave early for work, and return late, his eyes always avoiding hers. It was clear that he wasn't just angry, he was broken. Sophie had never felt so alone. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a battleground, filled with the remnants of love that had once seemed unshakable. But even as Sophie's marriage disintegrated, the other storm brewing in her life continued to swirl. Nathan and James had both sensed the shift in her. Nathan, with his fiery intensity, had been growing more possessive, his calls becoming more frequent, his gestures more demanding. James, with his quiet and calculated charm, had started to subtly pull away, sensing Sophie's growing internal conflict. She had tried to keep up appearances, to balance the delicate relationships she had woven, but the lies were becoming impossible to maintain. The first crack came when Nathan showed up unexpectedly at her house one evening. Sophie had just finished dinner with David, though the meal had been little more than a quiet exchange of glances and short words. The tension between them was palpable, suffocating, but Sophie knew she couldn't hide from the inevitable confrontation forever. Nathan had been calling her all week, his messages growing more urgent, and now, standing on her doorstep, he had come to confront her. "Where the hell have you been, Sophie?" Nathan's voice was sharp, filled with frustration as he stepped into the house uninvited. His eyes scanned her face, looking for any sign of the woman he thought he knew, but he found only a stranger. Sophie stood frozen, caught between two worlds, unsure how to navigate the turmoil she had created. David was in the other room, but Sophie knew there was no hiding now. Nathan wasn't just angry, he was desperate. He had crossed a line. His obsession had been growing, and now he wanted answers. "I've been here, Nathan," Sophie said, trying to keep her voice steady. But it trembled despite her best efforts. "You need to leave." Nathan took a step closer, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Sophie's stomach tighten. "No, Sophie. You don't get to push me away like this. You don't get to pull me in and then act like nothing happened." She flinched, his words cutting through her like a blade. But before she could respond, the door slammed open. David stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. The truth was out now, all of it. He had heard their voices, had heard enough to understand what was happening. He had caught them in the act of betrayal, just as Sophie had feared. "Get out," David's voice was low, strained. His eyes were filled with a rage Sophie had never seen before. It was as if the man she had once loved had been replaced by someone else, a stranger consumed by fury. He stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. Sophie stood frozen, torn between the two men, one the man she had betrayed, and the other the one who had lured her into this tangled web. Nathan sneered, taking a step toward David, his body tense, ready for a fight. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he spat. "She's mine, David. You don't deserve her." David's fists tightened. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words hit Sophie like a thunderclap. "I never wanted her to be yours. She was mine, Nathan. I was always there for her when she needed me, and look where it got us. Now you think you can walk in and take what's mine?" The atmosphere in the room thickened, heavy with tension and unspoken rage. Sophie could barely breathe, the weight of their confrontation pressing down on her chest. The room felt too small, the walls closing in on her as the two men squared off, their rivalry growing more intense by the second. Nathan took another step forward, his anger boiling over. "I don't care what you think. You didn't see her, you didn't listen to her. You're too blind to understand what she needed." His words were venomous, aimed at David's heart. Sophie tried to step between them, her voice desperate. "Stop. Please, both of you, this isn't the way to handle this." But neither man listened. Their anger, their jealousy, was all-consuming. In a sudden flash, the confrontation spiraled out of control. Nathan lunged at David, his fists connecting with David's chest, knocking him back. The force of the blow sent David stumbling into the wall, but he quickly recovered, rage lighting his eyes. They fought viciously, no longer concerned with words, but with dominating one another. The violence was primal. David grabbed a nearby vase, smashing it over Nathan's head, the sound of breaking glass sharp and terrifying. Nathan growled, swinging a wild punch that landed on David's jaw, knocking him to the ground. Sophie screamed, her voice lost in the chaos. The men didn't stop. They were consumed by their own fury, each blow, each hit, a reflection of the jealousy and bitterness that had been festering for weeks. Sophie watched, frozen, paralyzed by the horror of it all. She had caused this. She had set this train of destruction in motion. And now, both of these men were fighting over her, tearing each other apart in a violent clash that left her feeling sick to her core. It wasn't until Nathan grabbed a wrench from the floor and swung it at David, narrowly missing him, that Sophie's shock gave way to action. She rushed forward, pushing Nathan away with everything she had. The wrench flew from his hand, landing on the floor with a clang. She turned to David, his face bruised, his breathing ragged. Both men were breathing heavily, their clothes torn, their anger still simmering. The room was silent for a moment, broken only by the sound of their heavy breaths. Sophie stood between them, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. "Enough," she said, her voice breaking. "This is all my fault. Please, stop." But the damage was done. The two men, the two forces that had been fighting for her affection, were now forever broken. And Sophie, in her quest for connection, had lost everything. The consequences of her choices were now irreversible. The two men she had once sought to keep separate were now bound together by violence, their lives altered forever by the betrayal she had sparked. Sophie stood amidst the wreckage of her own making, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the room after the violent confrontation between Nathan and David felt suffocating, almost unbearable. Sophie stood there, watching the two men she had once cared for, now bruised and broken by their rivalry. Their anger, once so intense and unrestrained, had dissipated, leaving only the bitter remnants of the destruction she had caused. The house was a mess, glass scattered on the floor, furniture overturned, and the air thick with the weight of guilt. It was a scene that felt both surreal and painfully real, a consequence of Sophie's choices made in moments of weakness, loneliness, and desperation. David, breathing heavily, his shirt torn, stared at her with eyes that were no longer filled with love but with a deep, searing hurt. Nathan, equally battered, stood off to the side, his chest rising and falling with anger and confusion. Sophie could feel the weight of their gazes, as if they were both waiting for her to say something, to fix the shattered pieces of their lives with a simple apology or explanation. But Sophie knew that there was nothing she could say that would erase the damage she had done. She had pushed both men to their breaking points, and now, there was no going back. David was the first to speak, his voice quiet but filled with a quiet fury. "I never thought you'd do this, Sophie. I never thought it would come to this." His words stung, as if each one were a dagger twisting in her chest. "But you've made your choice. You've chosen him." Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had no excuse, no defense. She had betrayed him, not just physically, but emotionally. She had sought solace in the arms of others because she couldn't bear the emptiness, the loneliness. But in doing so, she had destroyed everything she had once held dear. David turned, not waiting for her to respond. "I can't do this anymore, Sophie. I can't live like this. I can't pretend that everything is okay when it's not." He walked toward the door, his shoulders heavy with the weight of resignation. "I'm leaving. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you for this." Sophie's world seemed to tilt. She wanted to stop him, to beg him to stay, to tell him that she was sorry, but she knew it would be futile. The distance between them had grown too wide, too deep. She had let it happen. She had let the cracks in their marriage become chasms that no amount of apologies could fill. As David stepped out into the night, Sophie realized that her family, the life she had built, was no longer hers. It had slipped through her fingers like sand. The next few days were a blur of motion. Sophie tried to reach out to David, but he didn't respond. She texted, called, left messages, but all of them went unanswered. It was as though he had disappeared from her life entirely. Nathan, too, had distanced himself. What had once felt like an intense, passionate connection now felt suffocating. His possessiveness had become overwhelming, his need to control everything in her life too much to bear. Sophie realized, with a sickening clarity, that both men were just distractions from the void she felt within herself, a void she had never truly addressed. Sophie wandered the house, unable to focus, unable to move forward. The silence that had once been comforting now felt like an unbearable weight. She sat in the empty living room, staring at the space where their family had once been, the memories of better times mocking her. She had chosen this path, and now she was alone. But as Sophie sat there, her thoughts turned inward. She realized that the real betrayal had been to herself. In her quest to find validation, to feel wanted, she had forgotten who she was. She had lost herself in the desires and approval of others, and in doing so, she had lost everything that truly mattered. The truth was undeniable now. Sophie had been seeking love and affection from the wrong places. Her marriage had been broken long before Nathan and James had entered the picture. The root of her pain, her loneliness, wasn't caused by David's neglect or Nathan's passion. It was her own failure to understand herself, to acknowledge her own needs, and to confront the darkness within her own heart. As the days passed, Sophie started to accept the painful reality. She had to rebuild her life, but this time, she had to do it on her own. She couldn't rely on anyone else to fill the emptiness inside her. It was up to her to find her own way back to herself. But that process wouldn't be easy. She would have to confront her own insecurities, her own fears, and above all, her own mistakes. Sophie knew she couldn't undo the past, but she could start taking the steps toward healing. The first step was acknowledging the damage she had caused, not just to her marriage, but to herself. It would be a long road ahead, and there would be no easy answers, but Sophie was ready to face the consequences of her actions and learn from them. The story of Sophie, Nathan, and James was a tragic one, filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and regret. But it was also a story of self-realization, a reminder that sometimes, in our search for love and validation, we lose sight of who we are. Sophie had learned the hard way that true fulfillment doesn't come from external sources, but from within. The journey to healing would be long and difficult, but it was the only way forward. What do you think about this story? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to confront your own mistakes and face the consequences of your actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.